see that? This is
hold on.
Okay, you tell me when and I'll speak. I'll say. Photographer, you're a good bass player.
So, okay, now we're gonna have show and tell here with Miss Sylvie Simmons.
Right. Well, what I'm showing and telling is these are photographs from Leonard's personal collection that he loaned me for use in the book, and some of them are delightful. I just love this one. It's almost like it's from a black and white movie with somebody waving goodbye to somebody heading off on a steamship across the Atlantic, and it's kind of what it was. The person they're waving goodbye to is Esther, who I believe took the photograph, Esther being Leonard's big sister, and that's the very elegant Masha. And Leonard, always back then, still immaculately dressed. This is a sweet one. This is the Pee Wee hockey team, Leonard the sportsman. And how's that coming out in your film?
Oh, it's good.
And Leonard had a confession to make to me. He said that cup, it was just a fake, you know. It was actually, we borrowed a cup so we could kind of pose for the victory that we would have when we had the game, and he said we lost. So he, you know, he's an honest man. He wouldn't let that one go by. This is let's get some more from childhood. This is Leonard as his first photo session, January 1935. It says on the back, aged 4 months. Look at that. You know, I think he kind of thinned down a bit. You know, he used to like fasting. He was very big on fasting because, you know, his mother would kind of feed him up as often as possible, and he wanted to keep an edge. A sharp edge in many ways was important.
These are like the actual photos.
These are actual photos.
I mean,
and this one, look at this.
Him,
this is Leonard, putty little kind of toddler with Masha again, always immaculately dressed. The whole family was everything about them was so immaculate. This one is a favourite. Just the funny thing about the early pictures of Leonard, it's just how happy he looks. You know, he didn't show any disturbing signs of either genius or melancholy at the youth. And as his friends say, you know, he was never a whiny depressive anyway, but, you know, there's just that kind of happy, joyous little child that you sometimes see in those famous home movies. So I haven't got these in any order. I'm just randomly finding things here. This is a lovely one. This was Leonard in London, living in London, in Hampstead, in the Pullman's boarding house, trying to write his first novel with the help of a Canadian grant. And this is this handsome dude standing next to Leonard, showing a bit of chest, is Mort Rosengarten, who I'll mention in the interview. He's a sculptor, and he and Leonard have been friends since the age of 10. And Mort was interesting. He told me how he also came from a very wealthy, well-to-do, even more wealthy, well-to-do Jewish family, and they were in the clothing business like Leonard's was. They had other businesses too, but they used to design their own suits when they were young, and have the tailors in the factory make their clothes for them. So that was it. I think that might be the end of show and tell.
Let's have a look at the pile there.
How did that go?
Let's add all the stuff.
Oh yeah, this is Leonard's grandmother, first vision of young Leonard. I don't know if quite why that holding him up there is, unless it was an offering to the gods, but or he wasn't quite as immaculate as a baby should be. So there we are. So yep, there's another one of Leonard shopping with mommy. But you see, never is Leonard badly dressed.
Who was taking these pictures?
Just family members. I mean, you know, it's one of the things that the publishers was asking, but we're going to have copyright problems. Don't bring back the trauma. Oh, look at this one. Now this is like the absolute picture. This is Leonard and his sister, and he's got a band-aid on his knee, and it's just too adorable. So yeah, there's many of these pictures are in the book. There's a whole bunch in the US edition, and I think even more in the UK edition that's coming out in November. And the only other difference between them pretty much is that the English have got trousers and the Americans have got pants, and I'm not quite sure what the Canadians have
One's
done.
in English and one isn't.
One's in an English that I was comfortable writing, and they very kindly translated it and took out all the S's and put Z's in, and all the OU's and put O's. I have my green card, but I haven't yet conquered the language. And this is, I guess this is Sexy Leonard.
Wait, let's
Well,
see. Okay, oh God, yeah.
And Sexy Leonard in his kitchen on Idra, the Greek island where he lived. So these are just some of the photos from his private collection that I got to see. These are kind of some of the research. I mean, this is a lovely old. And Mott's apple sauce was 49 cents, and Kraft grape jelly was 59 cents.
What year?
You know, things relatively haven't gone up too much when it comes to like 25 cents. It says. Don't see it. It's 1970 something. I haven't got my glasses. Can you read it?
74.
Okay, there we are. And that was by a wonderful Manhattanite called Danny Fields, who was an A&R member and a lecturer, and told me some fantastic stories about Leonard and Nico and Edie Sedgwick and Bridget Polk and the Warhol set, which Leonard kind of dipped a toe in.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So, you've written biographies on Neil Young, Serge Gainsbourg, and now Leonard Cohen. Yeah. All somewhat unique artists, one might say. What do you feel links them, and what drew you to spending half your life writing about them?
Well, that's really interesting. You know, if I did a Venn diagram, I've got Neil Young, Canadian. I've got Leonard Cohen, Canadian. I've got Gainsbourg, Jewish, and Cohen, Jewish. I mean, I'm not quite sure what it would come up with, but really, the one thing that links them is that they're all outsider artists. And by that I don't mean the kind of, you know, the people that they kind of make films about, emphasizing them sitting at home kind of dribbling and, you know, being looked after by their mum. No offense meant, though I'm sure there was some to outsider artists. But really people who operate on the outside of things. If you think about Gainsbourg, for example, he just followed his own path the whole time. He would step into the mainstream a great deal. He was writing for some of the greatest female singers of his time, but his own albums were completely out there. And he operated on the margins. He was a Jewish guy in Paris during the Nazi occupation, had to wear a star. Neil Young also working on the outside of things, doing whatever he damn well pleases with, whoever he damn well wants to do it with, whenever he wants to do it. Also a bit of an outsider, had polio as a child, epilepsy, so couldn't really get into the drug things. So again, slightly operating outside by his own laws. Cohen too, I mean, he born into a Jewish family, living in Westmount in Montreal, which was a kind of very wealthy Protestant community, which was in a province that was French. Also being a poet in a family that had rabbis and entrepreneurs, and wasn't really too much into that. Curiously, with Leonard, I found that he would often, almost like a kind of Forrest Gump thing, be in situations where great movements of the time were happening, but somehow, though he touched them, he was just passing through and doing his own thing. For example, the Beats, they never really accepted him as a Beat. He didn't want to be one of the Beats. The Warhol set, he knew them, and he knew some of the women very well, but he wasn't part of the Warhol set. With all three of these people, each one of them is a one-man genre. They are completely a template, and people will go in the studio and say, I want to sound a bit more Leonard Cohen, or give me a bit more Neil Young. But they can only be themselves. And I think, really, if you're going to spend your time writing about a person, you have to be interested. And I guess my taste in men and people and artists is consistent in that. I like those who follow their own path and go deep.
Sylvie Simmons.
Joseph Pope, Grammy winner.
What do you got there? A book. Oh, okay. I see that is your definitive biography of Leonard Cohen.
600 pages and blood on everyone.
3 years of bleeding. No wonder you're so skinny.
Can I borrow your glasses?
Sure. Read us a little.
Thank you. I wonder if these glasses will work on me. Yeah. This is from chapter 2, which is called House of Women. Leonard has just become a teenager, early teens, and at this time he was living with his mother Marcia and his big sister Esther. Leonard's father died when he was 9 years old, hence the House of Women. In his early teens, Leonard developed a keen interest in hypnosis. He acquired a slim, pocket-sized, anonymously written book with the title 25 Lessons in Hypnotism, How to Become an Expert Operator, and the extravagant claim of being, quote, the most perfect, complete, easily learned and comprehensive course in the world, embracing the science of magnetic healing, telepathy, mind-reading, clairvoyant hypnosis, mesmerism, animal magnetism and kindred sciences. On the front cover, beneath a crude sketch of a Victorian lady held spellbound by a wild-haired, moustached gentleman, Leonard wrote his name in ink in his best handwriting and set about his studies. It turned out that Leonard had a natural talent for mesmerism. Finding instant success with domestic animals, he moved on to the domestic staff, recruiting as his first human subject the family maid. At his direction, the young woman sat on the Chesterfield sofa. Leonard drew a chair alongside, and as the book instructed, told her in a slow, gentle voice to relax her muscles and look into his eyes. Picking up a pencil, he moved it slowly in front of her face, back and forth, and succeeded in putting her in a trance. Disregarding, or depending on one's interpretation, following the author's directive that his teachings should be used only for educational purposes, Leonard instructed the maid to undress. What a moment it must have been for the adolescent Leonard, this successful fusion of arcane wisdom and sexual longing, to sit beside a naked woman in his own home, convinced that he made this happen simply by talent, study, mastery of an art and imposition of his will. When he found it difficult to awaken her, Leonard started to panic. He was terrified his mother might come home and catch them. Though one imagines this would simply have added a sense of impending despair, doom and loss to the head he makes, that would make it even more exquisitely Leonard Cohen-esque. Chapter 2 of the Hypnotism Manual might have been written as career advice to the singer and performer Leonard would become. It cautioned against any appearance of levity and instructed, your features should be set, firm and stern. Be quiet in all your actions. Let your voice grow lower, lower, lower to just above a whisper. Pause a moment or two. You will fail if you try to hurry. When Leonard recreated the episode in his 20s in The Favourite Game, his first novel, he wrote, quote, he had never seen a woman so naked. He was astonished, happy and frightened before all the spiritual authorities of the universe. Then he sat back to stare. This is what he had waited for so long to see. He wasn't disappointed, and never has been. Although it is ascribed to his fictionalized alter ego, it's hard to imagine that these sentiments were not Leonard's own. Decades later he will still say, quote, I don't think a man ever gets over that first sight of a naked woman. I think that's Eve standing over him. That's the morning and the dew on the skin. And I think that that's the major content of every man's imagination. All the sad inventions in pornography and love and song are just steps on the path towards that holy... New books stick together, that holy vision. The maid, incidentally, was a ukulele player, an instrument his fictional alter ego took for a lute, and the girl by extension for an angel. And everybody knows that naked angels possess a portal to the divine.
Oh man.
It's funny.
Hello, Sylvie.
Hello, Joseph.
How are you?
I'm not too bad, thank you.
Okay.
Tired from all these book tours, but happy.
Happy it's done.
Oh yeah, Leonard has a great line. I think he quotes a friend of his who says it has the quality of doneness.
So, speaking of doneness, let's start at the beginning, the other end of doneness.
Mm-hmm.
You've been a writer for 35 years,
Exactly.
music writer, starting in Sounds, British newspaper. You're British. You've written about all manner of music in Kerrang, Sounds, Mojo. You've written a couple other biographies, but this biography in particular, what led you to writing about Leonard Cohen?
Well, Leonard Cohen had the courtesy to release his debut album the moment I hit puberty.
This exact moment?
We haven't got forensic evidence anymore. DNA testing wasn't available then, but yes, it was pretty significant to me, and I can still remember how his voice lifted me up off the bed where I kept my little portable record player by the side of the bed, and it pinned me against the wall, and there was a power to that voice that I didn't stop and analyze back then. I was a young girl, and I knew that this man and his music would mean an awful lot to me, even though he didn't look like somebody that I would like at the time. You know, before that I'd like the Beatles, you know, and I'd like the kind of hippie-looking, kind of Jesus-y boys, you know, who are young and cute. And Leonard on that first album sleeve looked like a serious man in a suit with fairly short hair for the time. I didn't quite understand it. There was an authority in his voice and an intimacy in his voice. But he seemed like he knew what he was talking about, and that I could trust what he said. And there was a mystery about him that I've been drawn back to so many times. And I think finally I decided that I would try and actually examine closer what that mystery was, get behind the smoke and the mirrors and see if I could possibly get to some of the depth of this amazing man.
When was the first time you actually spoke to Leonard, given that auspicious beginning?
Well, you know, I was well into my career as a music writer then. As you said, I wrote about everything, and so I might be interviewing Michael Jackson or Mick Jagger or you know, Motley Crue, just to keep the M's going, but, you know. But the first time I spoke to Leonard was actually by phone. It wasn't in person. I was living in London, and it was 1997. He was at the monastery, but when we spoke, he said he'd gone back down to LA to his office and was talking from there.
So 1997 was the first time you ever actually spoke to him?
The year after he was ordained a Buddhist monk on Mount Bodhi. And the first time I spoke to him in person was in 2001. He'd come over to England to promote his new album, the first since leaving the monastery, and the first of the new millennium, 10 New Songs. And our interview ended up lasting 3 days, no nights. And we just, you know, talked a lot, but still at the end of it, though I had reams and reams of transcript, there was still so much that I thought was left to know. The more I learned about him, the more I wanted to learn about him, and I wanted to try, if I could, to get past some of the elusive nature of his answers. Everybody leaves a Leonard Cohen interview feeling absolutely charmed and thinking they've got the most wonderful interview that ever happened. And then you realize that with his precision with words, somehow he's managed to kind of get you away from this essence that obviously was a thing that had appealed to me so much as a young girl and continues to appeal to me. So I think back, probably in 2001, I was thinking about writing a book. I read all the books I could find on him, devoured them, and there were still things I wanted to know. I knew it was going to be hard work and a long haul because there's so much depth and substance to the man and so many threads to his life that had to be followed. And finally I just bit the bullet and started it 3 years ago.
So did you start with, obviously you're trying to get to the essence of him in your biography, but did you feel you needed to start with factual, chronological, record by record, childhood? What took you down this crazy path?
It's interesting you should say crazy path, because I actually kind of set out almost a map. I mean, you know me personally, so you know I have no sense of direction. So that probably wasn't a very good thing to do.
I can attest to that.
It's, this huge, big kind of map that I drew of places I wanted to stop, little stations. It was more like a kind of tube map of England, in England, the underground map. But there were places I wanted to stop and things I wanted to discuss and people I wanted to meet. I had an idea. And so I set off chronologically originally because I thought I have to get the sort of skeleton of this man before I can put the meat and the sinew on it, and then also add the soul and find out what was in there, and then maybe discard the other stuff once you get to the soul. And so I did what everybody else would do some research, try and find out what I could and map it out. But almost as soon as I set out on that path, and I did start chronologically and go to Montreal in winter to start the whole thing and do my research there. As soon as I went on that path, the road started getting wobbly, like a kind of acid trip, and your legs...
I wouldn't know.
I know. I'm sorry, I've heard about acid from Leonard, he was a user in his time. But as I was set out on this path, my legs were getting rubbery and the road was becoming very uneven under my feet, and as I found out new things, there was just so many more different paths to take. So I did start it as a normal person would, hating to include myself amongst normality here. But, I haven't written it in Spencerian science. It is a straightforward biography, though it stops along the way and in the way that life does. I think you and I were talking about this before, that it was something I mentioned in my book on Serge Gainsbourg, that life isn't a series of and then, and then, and then. It's more like if you were taking a dog for a walk, it kind of darts down the street, comes back again, pees at one lamppost, circles it, goes to another lamppost, pees there, comes back to the first, and so on and so on. It's a very circuitous route that goes backwards and forwards, as well as up and down. And Leonard certainly led me on a merry path because geographically, spiritually, and romantically, he kept moving around.
Mm-hmm. I would argue a dog might actually have more purpose than we do.
Well,
a simple purpose.
The thing is actually though that Leonard he outdid the dog. I mean, he had so much purpose. I think, in case you ask me what did I discover most about Leonard, it really was, despite all the new stories I have, that really wherever he went and however he went there, he kind of stayed in one place, and that place was inside him, and it was very deep. He always went deeper and deeper into these searches within himself. So wherever he was living, usually in a place with plain walls and unadorned and inexpensive, wherever he was living, it was still so he could just go down deep inside himself. I don't think he even noticed his surroundings a lot of the time.
Well, it seemed one thing I noticed, as I perceive it, ultimately, it's a story of redemption, which is, I don't know if you would disagree with that. I find it uplifting, and that's probably not a word people use much in relation to Leonard Cohen, but I would in relation to how the story stands today. But also what you said about going deeper and deeper, it seemed he was consistent in always writing and seeking, and it's inseparable, the spiritual and the creative and the man himself and the never-ending path. So ultimately, so what life is, but you connected a lot of perhaps disparate things, like the thing you read about the hypnotism, which perhaps could be anecdotal. So were pieces of information like that within the context of Leonard, were those the kind of things that made you stop and go, aha, this might be a key that I'm looking for? Or did you start to develop the character and put the pieces in, or both?
It was wonderful. Sometimes it was like a kind of detective movie, but without the corpse. You know, it was constantly these strange clues, and there were endless aha moments. But then that would be turned on its head by something that either completely disproved that, or gave me some other kind of moment of insight. I was granted the right of access to his archives, and some of them weren't open to me. They're not open to anybody until a certain amount of time after his death, which I hope will be 30 years down the line, like his guru Roshi is still alive at 105. I think he should live longer than Roshi.
Well, Leonard will be touring for another 25 years.
Oh, minimum. But in those archives, I remember one day I was sitting there in this basement, and going through these things, and there'd be a big file, and it would have just a date on it, or usually a kind of approximate date, because some things hadn't been dated and sorted out. And I'd find a whole bunch of stuff, and it was great. It was almost like a kind of game where you could kind of create a story out of these few things you found. For example, there would be a library card that he'd given in requesting books, and there was a strange book on kind of the sexual diseases of Native Americans, or a book on fasting, or something on Cuba, and you think, okay, you just try and kind of play around and work out whether any of this is irrelevant, or if it's just a complete red herring, and sending you off on a strange path. So lots of aha moments in the research. But what you were saying at the beginning, redemption, yes, I think there is some of that in there, there was a very good review in downtown New York City. I saw it online, and he was talking about how many biographies he's read of artists who, like Leonard and a lot of people who create, suffered with depression and various things that held him down, and how that instead of being broken by it and ending up at another kind of casualty on the lost highway, he actually came through, beat the blues when he was an old guy, and as you can see, skipping on stage for his shows. A very contented man. I guess enlightened in some way.
Well, he's perhaps less burdened. Would you?
Very much less burdened. That's a very good way of putting it.
Yeah, because he comes across as very, obviously very knowing, but really gracious, truly appreciative of his audiences, which is a rare thing. I'm sure we all see a lot of concerts, and it's just struck me as so genuine. And besides that, I'm wondering, does he have any feelings about a book being written about him? I mean, do you think he thinks much about his past, his present, just on his merry way, or?
Well, I should say that Leonard didn't ask me to write a book. He didn't ask to read the book. But that didn't stop him from giving his support to the book. I think really, if truth be told, if somebody said to him, would you like a book about you or not, he would have gone for the not. He's a very modest guy. And if you think about it, here he is in his 70s having this huge acclaim, wave of love coming over him, people discovering him for the first time. Like, was he always this good? Was he always this wry and smart and sexy? But all of this is going on, and there's this person kind of poking around, like, hi, I'm just going to ask you a lot of questions about this man. I think, why would you want to have that disturbed? But as you say, gracious is a word that's always written about him, and it's exactly true. That's what he is. He's totally gracious. He didn't stand in my way at all on the book, and granted me interviews, and did not prevent me from having access to friends of his whom I asked for interviews, or associates. It wasn't just friends, it was his fellow musicians, record producers, fellow monks, two of his rabbis, one who actually was the rabbi who taught Leonard's bar mitzvah class. Now you imagine, Leonard's 78. Yeah.
Wow.
This is like the old rabbi from the Cohen brothers film, but older.
Older, yeah.
And very sweet and wise.
So you were able to get access and interviews with pretty much everyone you wanted to speak to, and people that had never spoken before. And I'm assuming part of that is your due diligence, being a good journalist. I'm assuming part of that is approval, as it were, tacit or otherwise. As you said, Leonard didn't stop you from speaking with anyone. Did you feel completely satisfied with that? Did you get to speak to everyone you wanted? Was there any hindrance ever put in your way?
There was never any hindrance put in my way that I know of. Only really two of the people that were on my A-list, and pretty much everybody was A-list that I was talking to. They were spoken to for a reason. You know, that I thought that they had something that I needed, some insights that I needed for a particular aspect of Leonard's life. The only two that eluded me were Joni Mitchell, who had been one of Leonard's lovers, and I thought would have had a very interesting story to tell me, because she was the first who was pretty much his equal on an artistic level at the time when they met, you know, which was in the 60s, and they were both pretty much starting out as musicians. Leonard had a background as a writer, an acclaimed writer, a poet and an author, which Joni didn't have, but you know, they were kind of equals and each were inspiring each other, so he was actually the muse for somebody instead of, you know, being, you know, it was a kind of active and passive role in the muse business going on. But she refused and would not be persuaded to speak. And the other person whom
she seemed, if I might, she seemed to, perhaps dismissive is too strong of a word, but it seems her attitude about Leonard's abilities changed a bit. Am I misreading that in the book? Or?
No, that's very, very astute. In the beginning, she had, when she first met him and she was interviewed, I saw these interviews, I didn't do them myself, they were in old magazines, where she was talking about him, giving her a kind of book list to read, you know, of all these poets and writers, and a huge influence on her. And but then in later years she was saying, oh, he's overrated, you know, he is a boudoir poet.
Yeah, there was some mention about lifting when I discovered that he had just taken these lines or...
Yeah. So I, you know, I think that she changed her views on it, but people do over the years, you know, but I would have still liked to have had a chance to interview her. I've interviewed her as a journalist in the past, but a bit long ago, and I would have hoped I might get something.
Yes.
And the other one that eluded me was Phil Spector.
Who is in jail, was in jail when you were trying to interview him, I take it.
Yeah, but I almost got myself into the cake. I tried to smuggle myself in, but I did write to him several letters, and I tried all sorts of ways via mutual friends and associates, but in the end he declined to talk. The album that he did with Leonard Cohen, Death of a Ladies' Man, it's quite notorious in rock history. It was one of several in which Spector was alleged to have waved guns around, and
A Phil Spector production. Yeah.
the bullets were used in the making of this album. But very interestingly, he and Leonard co-wrote the songs. He wrote the melodies and did the production, of course, and Leonard wrote the words. So to have had, that was his first really major kind of collaboration in such a thorough way. In fact, on the album, Spector gets his name first on it, which is curious considering Leonard has said that was one of the most autobiographical of his albums.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seemed, besides the creative struggle that he went through just in producing work, it seemed nearly every record he struggled with in many ways, whether it was outside producers or too much production, or perhaps trusting his gut when just on the moment and leading places he didn't think it was going to, which makes me think that maybe some of these records, if Leonard were given his druthers, they would have turned out quite differently. Do you think that's true?
I think that in a way some of them would never come out because Leonard I guess like a lot of deep people, is, and he is extremely deep, his work is very deep, is an absolutely remarkable perfectionist. He just found it hard to decide a song was ready to go. You know, he's famous for having written, you know, endless verses to Hallelujah. I think there's a sort of story where he and Bob Dylan met up in a cafe in Paris. It sounds too good to be true, but apparently it is true. And they were sitting there, and over coffee, Dylan had said to Leonard something like, you know, all the songs you write now are kind of like hymns, and I'm thinking of that song, Hallelujah. And Leonard's nodding, and Dylan says, well, how long did it take you to write that song? And as Leonard told me, he said, I told him 2 years. But actually it was more like 5 or 6, but I just felt embarrassed even to say 2. And he said, I asked Dylan in turn about the song he had written, a fairly new one, and I said, I really like this song, how long did it take you to write that? And he said, Dylan said, 15 minutes in the back of a taxi. So, I mean, one of them, with Dylan, he could just turn out all these wonderful words, and he didn't stop and kind of go back and censor himself as much as Leonard did. Leonard would just work a song like notebooks full of verses upon verses upon verses in it before he decided it was true. He often talked in interviews about truth. And if a song seemed true, or if the man singing it seemed like he was being untrue. So I think that this was one of his great kind of difficulties, but also one of his absolute, virtues and assets was that he had to hone everything to perfection.
There was one point, one of his muses later in life, Rebecca de Mornay, who, isn't there a story where he's writing a song, I forget what song, you can tell us, for the umpteenth time, and she finally just stopped him and said, that's the one.
Mm-hmm.
And he was quite pleased that someone had done that. Yes or no? Or
That's
and
exactly
then
true.
going forward, the process became a little easier when he collaborated on what's the
Anjani's
yes,
album, Blue
thank you.
Alert. You're absolutely right. I mean, with Rebecca de Mornay, she had told me that Leonard used to come up to her house, and she also had a Technic synthesizer as Leonard had. And so he'd just come up there and carry noodling away on the same song that he'd been working at his own home. Many other women have told me about Leonard's
The
endless
keyboard
work.
he was allowed to take to Mount Baldy, by the way.
Very
Yeah.
one. And she said that he was working on the song Anthem. That's the one with the line, there's a crack in everything, it's how the light gets in. And she said she'd known him to be working on that song for all the time of their relationship. And his engineer Leanne Unger had mentioned this song on previous albums, 2 albums before. So this poor thing had been laboured to death and back. And finally Rebecca just listened to one of the renditions and said, that's it, you got it, this is the one. And Leonard listened and said, okay, he trusted her. And he used that one on the album and gave her production credit. When I asked him, was this just like a lover's kind of folly, giving her production credit, he looked quite horrified. No, she did the job. She knew that sounded right, and I trusted her.
Yeah, well, doing the job seems to be something Leonard has great respect for order. And, right? I mean,
Yes.
Besides Spartan things, he liked order. And when he's put to the task of writing 3 pages a day, when he first shows up in London as a young man working on his first novel, the woman says, hey, your novel is great, you produce. And that was not a challenge or an insult, and that seemed to be something thematic that throughout his whole life, maybe it gave him that sense of purpose through his difficult times.
Absolutely spot on. He was very, very disciplined in many ways. Sometimes that discipline showed him things like he would often go on fasts For a long time he wouldn't eat at all on a Friday. It was his one day of fast a week. He would just drink water with a little slice of elegant lemon in it. He even did elegant fasting, so people told me. And when he was young, he had wanted to go to military school. And his father, who had fought in World War I as an officer, one of the first Jewish officers in Canada, had said, yes, he could go to military school. His father died when Leonard was 9, and so, the mother didn't particularly want him to go to military school, and it didn't happen. But Leonard always had a great interest in things that had a kind of routine, a regime, and a uniform. He was very comfortable living in the monastery as a monk, because he had the same clothes, the same routines pretty much every day. And he used to call the Rinzai Zen monks the Marines of the spiritual world. He loved that. And we were talking towards the end of last year about the tour, and the last big tour that he was on. And he just said that also had the sort of same kind of feeling to it, being, part of a, being in the army or something. Mm-hmm. Actually, one of his early bands he called The Army.
Which is great stories, by the way,
wow.
Viewers. You gotta pick the book for any number of reasons, but those stories in particular.
Well, this is the great thing about writing about Leonard, just as an interjection there, is that, there is so much in there that kind of is just so funny and so wild, and what you don't expect. You're expecting kind of Moses to kind of be walking through, Moses dressed as Dean Martin, kind of going through his life. But there isn't. There's absolutely wild escapades and really funny stories in there, I think,
Very funny. Mm-hmm. I think there's a certain irreverence, for lack of a better term, in Leonard Cohen himself.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, obviously his work, like you said, is deep and serious, but in current shows and stuff, there's just a lightness, and it's obviously got to be something that's always resided in him. Did you find that? Or, I mean, obviously later, like I said, I felt it was sort of redemption, and he himself says there was just one day when it lifted, something he'd been dealing with his whole life. But there always seemed to be something wry about his outlook.
Well, there was always a sense of humour. Sometimes it was gallows humour, as dark as you can
Still
get.
humour.
Exactly, I mean, in Dress Rehearsal Rang, song about suicide, as a hey prince, you need a shave, which was the thing that his mom used to always tell him to do. When you're feeling down, have a shave. How she knew, I don't know, but she told him, if you're feeling desperate or panic, you just stop and have a shave. But yeah, the humour was there. His friends from childhood, really close friends, had said, like as Mort Rosengarten, his friend from the age of 9, said, he said, Leonard wasn't a whiny, moany kind of depressive. Yes, he had depression and it was serious. It wasn't a laugh. But Leonard always had a smile, or he always had something funny to say or wise to say. And so, yeah, the humour and the gags were always there. I think he was rather taken aback that nobody got the gags, and that they would talk about, giving away free razor blades with his records. I think he kind of didn't do that. But, at the same time, when I met Leonard, it was post-monastery. Life had changed a lot. He hadn't been cured of depression at the monastery. He had to go to another guru in India. After that, not many people know about this part of his life. He was studying core Hinduism, Vedanta. But when he did kind of have that moment when the veil lifted and the background hum of misery, as he referred to it, disappeared, and he saw that gone, and wasn't just having to struggle to get through every day, as he's talked about before, the guru, the Indian guru, said to him, hey, for 30 years of Roshi, you had a good start on this, I can't take all the credit. So, there were times, I'm sure, when he must have been an absolutely hellish person to be around, and it must have been hellish for him to be himself, to go that deep into depression, and to be a serious writer, which means that you're sitting alone in 4 walls, trying to find some beauty from what you find in that depth. It's a hell of a task he set himself.
Do you think his recent work, his finding peace, as it were, is reflected in his work? And by Leonard time, he's producing things pretty quickly and is on the road and seems very happy. And how do you think that reflects in his work he's put out?
Well, I think part of it, he says with the sort of cheer in his voice, is like, time seems to speed up when you get nearer the end. And he's very serious about his work and wants to get it done. And so yes, I think a lot of the stuff that was on the most recent album wasn't instantly written. It had been around for a while, but he just finished it. A lot of times it's that, again, the quality of doneness. If he can get that into a piece of work, that's important to him. It's kind of hard to answer whether, the kind of his levity or his ease with the world shows through in the album more than in any other albums, because I think I've been somewhat kind of biased in my view from having seen him play so often on that last tour, and seeing him skip on and off stage, and seeing that kind of calm with which he treated touring, because
Young
he
man
was
with a dream.
You got it. He's a kid with a crazy dream.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm kind of, transferring that to the album, feeling that. But the same kind of themes are still there, there's still sex, God, and, and being adequate and standing up to the task are still in all of those songs. The darkness is still in there. There's even a song called The Darkness, So I think that he's still, and talks about that in the album, that he's doing the same old songs that he was doing years ago. And he makes fun of that. Leonard is just so many layers that you have to keep peeling one off, and then you find that somehow more layers have sprouted around before you get down to that core.
Do you have any expectation that he'll read the book?
Well, he didn't ask me to write it, he didn't ask to read it, didn't stop him supporting it. But, he says that, when I interviewed him last time, he seemed almost apologetic that he wasn't really thinking that much about the past. I think that mostly out of politeness he was trying to oblige when I was asking him to maybe give a deciding vote on when I've heard different interpretations of what was going on in his life, or I'd ask him a question about the past and then say, no, Leonard, you couldn't have been there then, because I have the studio cards from your studio and you were actually in there doing the 15th version of this song on that day. I think that he was really just trying to be kind and polite to me, but he said that he doesn't think about the past. He said, I don't live in that reality anymore. Whether that means that he's become the perfect Zen enlightened person and really does live in the present, I don't know. Or maybe he just doesn't want to risk changing this wonderful sense of calm he has now, because the past has got a lot in it that could cause him unhappiness.
Or maybe it's his way with words once again.
It could be. I mean,
Back to that first interview.
I know. I mean, that's why I mentioned that in the prologue of the book. We're in the room together, and I say, how much he loved magic and smoke and mirrors. He loved to kind of run rings around people, be they smoke rings or kind of debating society president as he was, rings. It's interesting. He told me one thing. I'd asked him about depression. He was listing all the drugs that he'd tried to take, legal and otherwise, to get the devil off of his back. And, I asked him if he'd tried psychiatry, and he said that he didn't really have any faith in that model. He'd had friends who tried it and it didn't work. But then afterwards I thought, he probably just thinks that he could just run rings around them with his words. He could do what he would with any good interviewer and somehow make them think, what a nice man, how gracious, gentlemanly and smart, and he's given me the best interview he's given anyone, and then see, interesting, invisible ink.
Well, I do find it interesting that he seemed to give you access where he didn't give others access. He didn't stop anyone from talking to you and gave you access to his personal archives and personal photos, and so while it's not an official biography, it's as close as it comes yet.
Leonard's word was supportive. I found out about this when I would get hold of, say, for example, his old rabbi or his alumnus association at the schools or old friends in the beginning. They would get back to me and say, we've checked with Leonard and he is supportive. This word kept sort of following me around. It's such an odd word and such a Leonard word, one of those words. But then it seemed to kind of get a bit better by the end. I think that what happened is when I interviewed everybody, because a lot of the people I was interviewing were not celebrities and were unused to being interviewed, and you know what we journalists are like. I mean, you're the other end of it. You know, you've probably experienced this. We can get stories out of people if we're on duty, you know, and we want to. And so I made it a policy to give everybody a full transcript that I made myself with their taped interview, so they could go through it, and if they were uncomfortable with anything or wanted to change it or felt that they'd said something wrong or I'd got the wrong end of the stick, that they could take it out and leave it off the record. That made for extra work because things were going backwards and forwards sometimes, and sometimes some of the great stories weren't told. On the other hand, because of the trust, so many stories that have never been heard before have been told. And at least I was able to go into the next chapter or the next paragraph even with a sense of knowledge of what was true, or at least what was likely to be true, because truth, as we know, is a, you know,
rational.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you think, given that Leonard is hardly someone who seems to do things casually in relation to his work and his life, do you think you were vetted behind the scenes in any way? I mean, he's supportive, but it doesn't seem like he would give you support casually.
Well, it's true that Leonard doesn't do casual. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. I mean, some of those pictures, as you see, you know, Leonard casual does not look casual. I don't think that's part of his language in the same way I never think he was a teenager. I think he came out Leonard, completely fully formed out the egg. But I don't think so. I don't think he's that concerned with things. I think that, you know, we got on well when I did the interview with him that went over a space of 3 days for Mojo. He was very kind about a book I'd written on Serge Gainsbourg called A Fistful of Gitane, and he'd mentioned that he knew, or he'd met Gainsbourg along the way, and we talked a bit about that, and he liked my writing. I think that for some reason or other that he trusted me. I don't know what it was. I told him at the beginning via his manager, I didn't approach him directly, that I was going to write this book with diligence and heart, and that I wanted to get some of Leonard's personality all the way through it. I didn't want to write a hymn book. I didn't want it to be dry and dusty. I wanted to feel some of the heart and the depth of this man in there. And I told him I was going to be thorough, very thorough.
And he also wanted he didn't want just effusive praise, right? He wanted, if you're going to write it, write the story. Yes or no? I mean,
you're absolutely right. I mean, it's so funny you should say that, because I don't know if this is revealing something because it wasn't sort of on the record, but when I saw him in December and he was kind of inquiring about how things were going with the book, but again, as I say, not because I think he wanted to see it or anything. I was particularly doing anything other than being polite. I have this woman in my house, and here she is, and I should ask her about her book. You know, it's like the Queen when she's wandering around. She asks these kind of questions. He was being Leonard the Queen at that moment. And he was saying that at one point, he said, well, you know, we don't want to whitewash, do we? And I thought that was really sweet, that he was really, I think, concerned with letting me take it where it went. And I think he certainly knew who I was talking to, or many of the people. I'm sure it must have been getting to the point where he'd pick up the phone and it's not another person from his past saying, oh, I just want to speak to this young lady. All right, because that's the great thing. I was a young lady to all of them. I'm going to hanging out with the old rabbi. I felt like I was 2-year-old, and so he must have just thought, been rolling his eyes sometimes when those phone calls came. But I like to think occasionally it made him smile. And I do know that one of the muses, I best not name her, but she said I spoke to Leonard, and I asked him, and he said, I think it's great you're talking to her. Go for it. So this is her reporting of it, and I think in the end you do think, well, this is interesting. She's talking to monks and she's talking to muses, she's talking to my bandmates, people from the past I was on tour with, And I think you realise that there was some pattern emerging and that this was deep. It wasn't superficial. I wasn't just going into a room and saying, hands up if you slept with Leonard.
Right, not throwing off a book, which 3 years, every page covered in blood.
Yeah, so it was a lot of work, Imagine these really long interviews, 110 of them, all of which I transcribed, hours of tape.
And you might end up with 1 or 2 lines from a 1-hour interview, right?
Yeah, that's it, and that was it. But at least it gave me, it was a sort of GPS along this strange wobbly road that I was talking about, It took me in the right direction, I think, and occasionally I hit dead ends and had to go back and try and unravel a bit more and go deeper. And it was really quite an exercise, and I'm probably going to get withdrawal symptoms very soon, I'm sure once the book tour is all over and I can't, talk about Leonard anymore or think about Leonard, I'm going to be wandering the streets like a zombie.
You can do the addendum in 5 years. I have a feeling Leonard will have a peak. I know, just gut feeling,
I think he said that he's going to be touring until he's at least 80, into his 80s, because he reckons he's going to take up smoking again, so he can sneak behind the bus at the age of 80 and, horrify everybody with a cigarette.
Why not?
Have something at that age. But he's, I think, really, really happy to be doing this life on the road. It's interesting how Bob Dylan is probably the nearest person that he ever gets compared to, And you can see in a way some of the reasons why they would. But Dylan's been doing his never-ending tour for some time now, and Leonard's a little bit late into the game. But I think that after that amazing regime that was the nearly 3 years of 3 hours a night on the road, that he loves that. That it gives him a sense of full employment, of having a function in the world, of not being some old guy sitting at home staring at the walls and trying to get these gems out of him. And it's interesting, when he was at the monastery, he had hardly any time to himself because of that particular regimen. But he said that it actually helped him focus on the work in the time in between. I guess it's like if you're a writer and having a deadline. I mean, you're somebody who works, on music on your own, and do you find that, it would be easier if you had a deadline?
Yeah, there's different personalities, yes. But I think it's more if time is taken and accounted for when you have your own time and you want to feel productive, it makes the time more valuable.
I think
right?
That's
so you have more of a sense of purpose, which in a sense would be a good reason to be in a monastery, but I'm not sure anyone I know could live for 5 years in a monastery, so
I went up there for a week.
Maybe I'll try it in my 70s. I got a little time.
That's true, it's pretty cold up there. Well, actually I went in summer and it's full of flies and things that bite. There were rattlesnakes there. The monk was telling me to keep to the path, otherwise I might get bitten by a rattlesnake. And he said, if the bear comes, there's a bear that comes, he said, let me know and I'll throw a stone at it. But you could tell it was going to be the most gentle, benign Buddhist tossing of a stone and not some huge catapult with a boulder going at this poor bear. Yeah,
so is there anyone else that you would consider delving that deep into?
Right now, I think
or do you not have it in you anymore?
I'm thinking that maybe a Facebook post is about all I've got to manage for the rest of my life. If it can't be done in haiku form, I will not. I mean, I think my last book are actually short stories, and they seem lengthy now, and so I started writing some 1-minute stories that were just really concise.
So if you can't read it on your phone.
Yeah, well, I haven't got a smartphone. I'm still in the primitive, wind-up version of the cell phone, Hold it up to the sun and maybe it will work. But I think that, the person I really wanted to write about was Leonard. I put it off for many years. I did it. Right now, I can't imagine, pursuing somebody's life as deeply as that, because really it's quite weird when you think about it. You're writing about a living person. You're kind of being very intrusive and very nosy. I don't mind being nosy, it's my job, but much more nosy than you would be, generally speaking. And, you have to kind of immerse yourself into it to such a degree that you're almost identifying with them. And, in a way you kind of don't want to do that with just anybody. It has to be somebody that you admire enough and as an artist, and that you find interesting enough that every waking minute when I get up I'm thinking about, or was thinking in writing the book about Leonard, every dream would have Leonard. And not one of those kind of dreams either, it would have been much more fun. But Leonard sort of directed me to something that I've forgotten to write about, and when you wake up you realise that that didn't actually exist. It's just a general panic of trying to get things right. So his life, also the other thing that's interesting is when you write about somebody that you really admire, there's always the risk that you, by the end of it, don't like them.
Yeah, sure.
And that didn't happen with Leonard Cohen. I just appreciated him even more. The depth of the man is just so much more than I ever thought.
Well, it's a very loving portrait of him, but I think...
But not a hagiography or a
Not
whitewash.
a hagiography, no, or a whitewash, no.
Yeah.
I think it's the only way to really do something. You have to have respect for someone to go that deep into it, and for their work, because you wouldn't tolerate what you went through, right?
Like the one time, when you mentioned the monastery, I was trying to follow his path, and I actually went and stayed at the monastery, and I was there 2 days, and Leonard was there 5 years.
Living as a monk, or as a member of a monkette.